When you think about poverty in the United States, there's probably three things that you get wrong. One, you think that poor people are some kind of permanent underclass, people who have always been poor, whose parents were poor, whose children will be poor. There's us, the normal functioning members of society and the economy, and then there's the poor people. They're over there, and they're not like us, and they don't contribute to the economy that way we do, and they're different from us. One of the reasons why they're different is two, they don't work. And three, they don't have to work because they get enough help from the federal government. And these three myths, this permanent other group that doesn't work and gets a lot of help from the government, are part of an overwhelming mythology that has at its heart that the reason why we have poverty in the United States is because of poor people. It is a function of their own personal failing, is a function of their own lack of motivation. Poverty is caused by poor people, and that's it. The reason why I bring this up now is that this mythology is not only grossly inaccurate of how the economy works in the United States and where low-income Americans come from, but it's a pretty dangerous mythology to add to policymaking. In real time right now, the Republicans are trying to pass a $4.5 trillion tax cut. They've said they don't have the money to pay for it, so they're going to put at least $3 trillion of that on a credit card and onto the national debt. But a solid trillion they would like to cut from spending, and they are taking dead aim at food stamps and Medicaid. And their purported reason, as Mike Johnson put very clearly in a press conference, is that the reason why we have to spend money on poor people is because they don't work. And in fact, his direct quote is, work is good for you. You find dignity in work, and the people that aren't doing that, we're going to try and get their attention. That's the mythology at play. They don't work. I support them through the federal government. They're not like us. And so now we just need to jolt them awake and give them some motivation, and voila, there won't be people in need in America anymore. Let's go through each of these myths. Let's talk about why they're wrong. And you'll, I think, see that the biggest problem with this massive tax cut, the biggest problem with this mythology is that it leaves the actual cause of poverty and economic insecurity unaddressed. They're risking so much more than just cutting off funds and help to people in need. They're failing once again to solve the actual problems facing so many Americans. And it is so many Americans. Starting with the first myth, poor people are some permanent other group. Categorically wrong. Two studies show why this is clear. The first looked at household income for 48 months and studied how many months household income fell below the poverty line. So if poverty means you don't have enough money, the federal government has operationalized a definition of both what money is, it's cash going into a household from whatever source, and what not enough is. That's called the federal poverty line. So researchers at the Census Bureau looked at 48 months of income and measured how many people fell below the poverty line in any given month. And what they found over a 4-year period is 34% of Americans became poor. Now, they didn't stay poor. Poverty is a transient state, not a permanent one. 34% of households became poor. The average poverty spell lasted less than a year, and then they got right back up again. Poverty isn't a disease that affects one isolated group of people. It is a risk that a third of Americans are exposed to at any given time. Now, they did see people who were poor all 4 months, what they refer to as chronic poverty, but it was 2% of the population. So when you think of poverty, you're thinking of the 2% that has always been poor, because it's a lot scarier to think of the 34% who will be. Another set of researchers, rather than looking at monthly income, they looked at annual income, and they looked at tax returns to see which percentage of tax returns fell below poverty. And then instead of looking at a 4-year period, they looked at a 10-year period. So I have 10 years worth of income for every American. What percentage of household income falls below poverty in a given year? It's 40%. So if I were to look at every American for 10 years, 40% of them will have a year in poverty. Y'all, that is massive. 30 to 40% of Americans are at risk for poverty. That is poverty in the United States. It's not a state, it's a risk. It's a risk that a lot of people face. Why do so many people face this risk of poverty? 2, this myth that poor people don't work ignores how many people who are working and poor. Americans have a very weakly regulated low-wage labor market that not only doesn't pay that much money, but kind of churns people in and out of jobs because they're very low quality. So you can think of this in a couple ways. The first is, like, put in your mind everybody in the U.S. who is working full-time, full year. They have a 4% poverty rate, meaning that even though they're a full-time worker, they have such a low hourly wage that 4% of them are in poverty. Again, you're going to say like, well, that's not that many workers, but it is a big share of the poor. It's a small share of workers. It's a large share of the poor. Now I'm going to look at everyone who's working full year in the United States, but I'm going to look at part-time workers. 14% of them are poor. So they're working all year, but they don't have enough hours or wages to push themselves above poverty. So workers have their own poverty rates. But then really what pushes most workers into poverty, in addition to low wages and low hours, it's unstable employment. Some of these low wage jobs, they're just really hard to keep. One study on paid sick days illuminates really clearly why this is. So Seattle passed a paid sick leave law saying that you couldn't fire people for calling in sick, and they had to accrue paid sick days. Well, researchers found that it increased the earnings of women by $2,400 a year. And it wasn't because they were taking $2,400 worth of sick days. It was because it was a lot easier for them to maintain a job when they weren't fired for being sick or when their kid was sick. It also reduced their poverty rates. Poverty is a function of low wage, unstable employment and earnings, and we have a lot of that in the United States. That's why up to 40% of Americans can fall into poverty at a given time. Now, there are lots of poor people who don't work, but they tend to have one of two characteristics. One, they're disabled, or two, they're caregiving for children. If the labor market were more amenable to either of those populations, we would probably have a lot fewer people in poverty. But unfortunately, the US is very severe in that it doesn't like to make space for parents in the workplace, and it doesn't like to make space for disabled people. And if you don't believe me, you should know that disabled employment rates peaked during the pandemic and the years afterwards when they were allowed to work from home, and they'll fall again. Now, the third myth, probably the biggest misconception, is that most poor people are like rolling in funds and resources from the federal government. Be clear here that the poorest group of Americans are children. They have the highest poverty rates, and a lot of support programs go to them. Elderly people get Social Security. They're not that poor. So if I'm thinking of working age adults in the United States, there's about 20 million who are poor at any given time. 500,000 people get welfare, and 4 million people get disability from SSI. So that means 15.5 million of this 20, or 3/4, get no cash from the government. None. Now you might say like, oh, well, they get housing and they get childcare and they get all this other stuff. Okay, again, 20 million adults in the United States who are poor. About 4 million people will get housing assistance, and fewer than 1 million will get childcare assistance. Another 15 million who don't get either of those things. The only two things that most poor people get, even if they're adults, is food stamps and Medicaid. They are the most generous programs in terms of coverage. They don't give you any cash. You can't buy diapers with food stamps or Medicaid. You can't pay for rent with food stamps or Medicaid, but you can get you can get food and health insurance. Now you might seem like, well, then you're all set. I don't know about that. I mean, food stamps, the average benefit is under $3,000 a year. It's not that much money, not enough to live on. I don't know if you could actually feed yourself on $3,000 a year. But, this is the reality, right? And that's what makes these types of tax cuts built off of benefit cuts so dangerous, because it doesn't address the problem. It doesn't address where poverty comes from, and it doesn't address the multitude of market failures that low-income Americans have to deal with. The low-wage labor market, the housing market, the childcare market, the healthcare market, all of these are left unaddressed. You can kick people to the curb and say it's your fault for having a hard time, but you don't fix the problem. And by giving away $4.5 trillion in taxes, you make the problem that much harder to solve.